Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. I'm putting on the record that we have a terrible snowstorm. So we are lecture capturing what is happening today so that anybody who wants to see this talk or wants to use it for class, do we have your permission?
Yes. Absolutely.
Okay. So, say it again.
The only part that you heard was on the mic. Absolutely.
Thank you. Absolutely. And welcome everyone to the Edwards School of Business and to the 9th presentation of the Gordon and Maureen Haddock speaker series on entrepreneurship. This is 9. 9 is pretty amazing. And when you walk in the school, you see immediately when you walk in the front doors and you turn to your, what hand is that? Right. To the right. Where's my wedding band? To the left. When you turn to your right, you see an entire wall of our former speakers. And I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that you're part of the building of that wall by coming here today. So I'm pleased today, it's me who gets to introduce Gordon and Maureen Haddock, who, if you could stand up and turn around and curtsy or something. Yes. Exactly. They're very good friends of the Edwards School of Business. I've known them since the moment of my arrival, and they are what they like to call serial entrepreneurs. They're loyal. They are adventurous. They take risks. Maybe they don't think they're risks at the time, right? We'll have a talk about, do you really think you're taking risks or not? But they are people who have invested wisely, invested foolishly, learned lessons, lived long and full lives of adventure, and have a lot to offer to us professors, students, faculty, staff. All of us can learn lessons about ventures to go into, ventures not to go into, ways of assessing things, and it's really been a pleasure knowing them. It's very fitting that we have them here today because they also, I think you would be okay with me saying that you're donors to the school, and because we're approaching our 100th anniversary as a school, they also have made it a personal point of donating $100,000 over many donations over many years to the school in celebration of the 100th anniversary. So thank you very much. We don't have a sign here that lights up that says applause, please. So that was very spontaneous. And because this also celebrates entrepreneurship, I want to unveil something that's very entrepreneurial here. This is the first ever debut performance of the Catchbox. And what this is a microphone. And if people want to speak, instead of us running around with microphones so we can capture you for posterity, we will throw you the catch box and you will catch it. And in the top where there's a little bit of an X is where the microphone is actually planted. And this is kind of a fun thing. So please be the first person to put your hand up and be the first ever. Would it be the first ever? For a real, like, event, not a, okay, be the first ever catcher of this new product. And now it's my pleasure to actually have Gordon Haddock come up and introduce our speaker today, if you could.
Thank you, Dean. Before we start, I just wanted to say one thing, especially before I do the introduction, especially for some of you that have been to our speaker series before, and I know there's a few, like my former business partner and good friend at the back who's been to all of them. I'm going to steal a few lines from another introduction because, well, for two reasons. One is I'm old and I don't want you to think I have Alzheimer's. But two, most importantly, it's appropriate for this introduction because it gives a historical background and sort of the historical climate, business climate. So forgive me for doing that, but I just found it just blended in perfectly. So That's it. That's my excuse. How the world of Saskatchewan has changed. I graduated in December 1971, and in 1972, my good wife and business partner opened our first business. And times were very different then. You never heard the word entrepreneur. You certainly didn't see entrepreneurial classes at the college. And you certainly didn't hear students talking about starting their own business. All you heard was the sound of car motors, of the cars filled with U of S grads heading off to Alberta, where there were lots of jobs and lots of opportunities. And the saddest part about that is a lot of those jobs were created by entrepreneurs from Saskatchewan who left this beautiful province for Alberta. It was a land full of promise and, as I said, opportunities for success. Our province at that time was governed by a socialist NDP government under Premier Alan Blakeney, who banished this province from the international investment community for decades when he nationalized a large part of the potash industry and started a government oil company, amongst many other things. That's just to name a few. So the NDP, except for the 8 or so years during the 1980s, governed this province until 2007. And then that's when I think our province was finally allowed to develop its true potential under the present Wall government. Once released, the people of Saskatchewan have shown Canada and indeed the world what they can accomplish given the right economic climate, and as a result, international confidence and investment have returned. Now, even though entrepreneurs are very, and may I say, extremely optimistic, and my wife will vouch for that, there are many times during these dark years and decades when you felt our great province was never going to change. It was never going to develop and grow and never really prosper. And you sometimes felt alone if you were entrepreneurial. But through it all, there was always one bright light forcing its way through the darkness. It was the positive speeches made by our guest today. And anytime we saw that Paul was speaking, we made every effort to attend that event. He always had an uplifting message. He always left feeling better. He always left with a renewed energy to continue. And you always left with a renewed energy to fight against the NDP's goal to hold the province back, to keep it locked in its past, to keep it stagnant, a goal to prevent the success of the entrepreneurial spirit. So, Paul, there's only one thing to say. Thank you so much for all those wonderful speeches through all those decades. Thank you for keeping the lights of optimism and entrepreneurism on. May I introduce you, Mr. Paul Martin.
Thank you, Gord. That's wonderful. Thank you. Well, thanks very much. As you almost heard in the introduction, I come to this platform with a little bit of trepidation because I'm probably more well known as a journalist and a writer than I am an entrepreneur. So it's a bit of a stretch for me, but bear with me. We'll give her a go, and I'll walk you through one man's cloudy past and see if we can find a little more light. And as Gord described it, I was kind of fortunate because if you're going to succeed in business, it's always good to differentiate yourself to try and figure out how's my business or my product going to be different than everybody else's. So I had this grand opportunity to be the one voice of optimism in a cloud of darkness. So it was really easy. I always used to say I carried this because I was the counterweight for my industry, and and I needed to have a few extra pounds because the media is not particularly well known for its ability to pursue positive stories or to focus on that. But I have to say, I also was, there were times when I was critical. I once, in a column I wrote for the Star Phoenix, I wrote, and it was in that downtime you were talking about, that the only crane we saw in Saskatoon was actually migrating. So, so I've had an opportunity to work in this market when it was down and when it was up, and so I'll just kind of maybe track a little bit through my history. And you graduated 71, you said, from this school. I never quite graduated from this school, but I did have Georgina Goodspeed as a prof, so that's you too, right? You too, right? There you go, yeah, exactly. So that dates me a little bit. I started the year after you quit, or finished here, and I didn't get through very far, but I need the dean to know that there actually is a certificate with my name on it, signed by the dean and the assistant dean, that says I have an MBA. I don't have an undergrad degree, but I have an MBA from this college, and it's a Master's of Business Achievement. And in brackets it says without calculus. Now, it's not business administration, it's business achievement. There were two of them granted. I have one, Neil McMillan has the other. Neil may well have been a part of this at some point. But I started out, after graduating from high school, I came up here, and I must say, it was much more at my father's insistence than mine that I went on to university, and I did not flourish. I graduated at Christmas of the first semester, and I went back home to where I grew up in Weyburn. And I went home to break the news to my dad mostly, but my parents. We went out for dinner, and I said I wouldn't be returning to university. It really wasn't me, and these kinds of things. And sitting at the next table was the owner of the radio station in Weyburn, and he said, "Hey, what are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm back." And he said, "Do you want a job?" That's what the market was like in 73, 74. It was just, "Do you want a job?" So I said, "Yeah." So I said, "Well, I'll come in the morning and you can talk to the program director." So I went in, that was Tuesday morning, and they said, "Okay, you can start on Monday, and the guy that you're going to be replacing, I'll fire on Friday." That's the way it was working in those days. So I started out as a broadcaster, and I worked they put me in the newsroom because they assumed I didn't have enough musical talent to spin the hits, and it was the best luck decision that ever happened to me. Fast forward some years later, a good friend of mine said, "You're not really a journalist, you're an entrepreneur whose business happens to be journalism." And that really did kind of evolve in that direction. So I went from there to, I tried again that university thing. I went to the U of R for a little bit, and I was working part-time at CKRM Radio. They were very kind to work around my class load. I then got, here's one. Who's studying HR? All right, this is one. This is a really cool lesson on how not to do something. And guys, you will appreciate this. So I'm like this afternoon part-time news anchor, going to university in the morning, and I'm in the men's can at the urinal. And the program director steps up to the one beside me and says, "I'm firing your boss tomorrow. Do you want his job?" It's not, for the UHR types, it's not the best place to be offering jobs. I said, "Of course I'll accept that job," because I was getting married in 3 weeks, and I knew there was money involved in this. So I finished out that semester at the U of R, and needless to say, was not excelling again. So there was one class I was really in trouble in, an English class, which, for a writer, that's probably the worst class to fail in. But, it was one of those hybrid classes. We had a part of it was Shakespeare, and a part of it was, I don't even remember, grammar, I think. And then there was a graduate student who was teaching, and she was teaching us literature. So she had this thing going where she gave us a book and said, write 14 two-page essays out of this book or whatever. I got around to writing one, and it was a good one, though, I'll give you that. And I knew I was in trouble, so what did I do? I was news director. I hired her. I gave her a freelance gig on the radio station talking about new stuff going on in the university world. I got an 87 in that class. I never handed in an assignment in the other two pieces, so clearly she was the one giving away the marks. But I thought, hey, there's something to this. This entrepreneurship was starting to bud a little bit. So from there, I decided I'd had enough broadcasting, and There was a business in Regina at the time called the Regina Court Club, and it was about 18 months old and had gone through 4 general managers, and I thought that'd be a good job, so I applied for it and got it. And there were 2 of us finalists, Bill Manchuk, who was playing for the Riders at the time, and me. And I won. I was 23 years old. I got to be GM of this place, and I really didn't know diddly about business. But I'll tell you, that was the greatest learning experience I had, because this place was in financial train wreck. And every day I got to talk to a lawyer, a banker, and an accountant. And it was that MBA I took like on the fly. It was an amazing experience, and we're churning through people, and it was just big monster of a building that was not much more than a fad. The owners of the place were a conglomerate of, there was an architect and a builder and an engineer, and all these guys threw in their services, and they built this thing, and they never financed it properly. Interest rates went through the roof. I made 1 monthly payment on because we were on a floating loan, we didn't have a mortgage. 26% interest was the highest that we paid. So you think about that, 26%, that's a quarter of the value of the mortgage or the loan paid in 1 month. And that was just the interest before the principal. It was, and we made it. So I did that for 3 years, and a guy came along, and he had a publication called Saskatchewan Business Magazine. And he was out of Winnipeg, and he had built Manitoba business, and he added Saskatchewan business, and his backers were the Richardson family from Winnipeg, and he had a dream of a national chain. And so the Saskatchewan magazine was in need of an editor, and he caught my name, so he came over and talked to me, and I took that on. So it was my return to media it's kind of dabbled in broadcasting all the way through. I did weekend shifts at the radio station and stuff just to buy gas. But this return to the media, I was part-time as the editor, and I did that for about 6 months, and then he said, why don't you come and run this thing? So I quit the court club. I want you to know, 18 months later, it went broke. I kept it afloat 3 years, right? Yeah, exactly. And so I went to work for this guy, and then we set up Alberta business, and bought BC business, and then Atlantic business, and Montreal business, and ultimately Asia Pacific business. So we had this chain across the country, and I was sort of the second or third person in the organization that he'd hired. So I had an opportunity to grow, and we did a lot of national stuff, and we did a lot of world stuff. And it actually, there was an experience that happened in there, and I wasn't going to talk about this, but now that I get to it, I think I will. It happened in about 85, and if I'd have been smart for 2 cents, I wouldn't be here today, because I'd be in Arizona or Florida or someplace, because I saw something going on, and I wasn't smart enough to put the pieces together. So Mike Harcourt was the mayor of Vancouver at the time. He went on to be premier of BC, but he was still mayor at the time. And we had this Asia magazine, so I got to tag along with them. We went over to Hong Kong and then into Guangzhou. And Guangzhou, the 3rd largest city in China, was Vancouver's sister city. So we went and did 4 days in Hong Kong, and we basically met a lot of political types and investors. And here was the interesting thing. Hong Kong is the size of Saskatoon, footprint-wise, has 6 million people at that time, but it had 8 million jobs. So they were short 2 million people. So if you think the shortages we had in Saskatchewan in the last few years or something, this was something to behold. So what the investors did was they just pushed all those jobs up the Pearl River into Guangzhou, and the Chinese government, still a communist government, but they had opened up something they called the Shenzhen pre-economic zone. And Shenzhen is the sort of provincial area around Guangzhou. So we then, after 4 days in Hong Kong, went up and spent 3 days in Guangzhou, and we get to meet, the 2 mayors, they're cousins or sister city mayors. So Harcourt says to me, I'm going to meet my counterpart. Do you want to come along? Sure. And we had this delegation of Vancouver business guys, but I was the only one that got the invite. So we trundled on over. I said, when are we going? He said, Saturday night at 6:30. I said, why would we go? Why would you have your meeting with this guy Saturday night at 6:30 of all times? And he said, because we can get there then. And I didn't realize how congested the city was. And so we go, and these 2 mayors are swapping stories, war stories, and Harcourt says to his counterpart, what's the biggest problem you got right now? And he said, I actually have the city cordoned off by the military. I said, why would you do that? And he said, well, you were in Hong Kong a couple of days ago. You saw all the jobs they've pushed up the Pearl River. He said, those jobs are here. People are moving from the country, from the farm, to the city to take those jobs, and they're coming at a rate of 6,000 a day, and I can't accommodate them. So I've cordoned off the city till I can get some housing built. It dawned on me, there wasn't a mayor in Canada who wouldn't kill for 6,000 jobs. This guy was getting it every day. But what was going on was this massive shift in China, moving from rural to urban. Since, in the 30 years that's been going on, 500 million people have left the rural countryside of China and relocated into cities. They've taken the jobs in the factories that are supplying all the stuff you and I buy. And it's really what shaped Saskatchewan in the last 10 years, is this middle class emerging in China has purchasing power. And the first thing you demand when you have purchasing power is a better diet. And that's put a lot of pressure on farmers to increase their protein output. And that has subsequently led to, there's no more farmland, so we have to make more food off the same land base. Farmers are under intense pressure to increase their productivity. That means more fertilizer. And that demand is what triggered this round of growth that we had in Saskatchewan, was all of this investment that moved into here. And it was interesting because I saw it in '85, but wasn't smart enough to figure out that if I went home, sold my house, bought a lot of potash stock, I probably wouldn't be here today, right? But it's these mega things that you see a little corner of information, and as a journalist, this was really powerful to me. I saw a little corner of information. I didn't know how to interpret it. And fast forward 25 years, it profoundly changes an entire economy, an entire country, an entire province. And that drove home the message for me that I must be much more diligent when I'm looking at stories and trying to dig deeper all the time, peeling back that onion a bit further, and don't just look at symptoms, but actually try and get to the ailment. So I always, when I'm working today, I keep a note in front of me all the time that says, dig deeper. Just reminds me, dig deeper. Always ask another question. Just keep penetrating and making sure you're getting to the real root of the story, as opposed to just somebody's spin on it or a very superficial look at it. So that little stint in the print media with Saskatchewan Business, I kept doing that for quite some period of time, but it was a renaissance period for television also. And CTV in Saskatchewan in those days had a massive budget. They had gone through an ownership change. The Eaton and Bassett families in Toronto, the Eatons were watching their retail empire spin into the toilet, and the kids had no capacity to fight back because old Timothy Eaton, had tied up the estate so tightly because he wanted his name over the door for the rest of, to live long after he was dead. The kids couldn't sell the asset. So they had to basically ride it into the ground. And it was the kids who ended up looking like the idiots in all of this. They said, stupid kids don't know how to run it. Grandpa leaves you a business and you don't know what you're doing. But in fact, Grandpa hamstrung them. So the kids decided, if the retail empire is going to collapse, we better get another business. And they decided they would buy CTV. So they were putting that together, and there was the Ctv Operations in Saskatchewan. There were 4 of them, and they were somewhat disparate and independent. The Sifton family in Regina, and the Nelson family up here, and Sifton sold to the Hill family, which is the name for the Hill School of Business at the U of R, and a family that has been in business for about 110 years now. I had the opportunity to write a book on them, so I probably know that corporate story as well as anybody in the province. But they all put this all together, and the Bassetts and Eatons had bought this thing, and to persuade the CRTC to let them assemble all of these independent stations across the country, they poured massive budgets into local programming. I got to be the lucky guy standing on the street corner when that happened. They decided they would do a business show. So the only guy they knew who knew journalism and business was me, so they phoned me up because I'm the radio guy and I was the print guy, and we created a TV show called Saskatchewan Business. Pretty creative, huh? And so we just started chronicling stories around the province, and it was interesting. They said, okay, how do you want to do this? And I said, we'll do 1 issue and we'll do 3 profiles. That'll be an hour-long show. So we took an issue and we would chase around on it and we'd get the various sides. But mostly it was about profiling entrepreneurs, and I realized that kind of became my role in the Saskatchewan market. I was to chronicle and be the corporate historian, if you want, of those business success stories, because they were not flashy and sexy for the mainstream media. It needed someone in a business section that would do that, and that kind of fell to me. So the first one I did was Sylvia Kish. You would remember Sylvia, right? She's the most amazing entrepreneur. She had a ladies' wear store, high-end ladies' store in Priestville. Yeah, exactly, right? You giggle at that. Priestville, Sask. They drove hundreds and hundreds of miles. They would fly to go to Sylvia's store. I mean, she created a cachet like nothing you've ever seen. They were coming from all over North America to go to her store. And they just said, she's our agent. She goes to New York, she buys the stuff, and all I got to do is go to Priestville. And it was this crazy operation. You would go there for a day, and it was like a spa, and you would try on clothes, and she would have models, and then they would have, you'd have tea and wine and all kinds of stuff. It was a full day's experience. It wasn't just going to the mall and hitting 7 shops. It was you went to one and you spent the day there. So I thought, what a cool story. So that's where we started. And Saskatchewan Business did very well as a television show. We pretty much won every award you could ever imagine. We took that thing around the world. We went to China with it. We went to England. We did a piece on the Channel linking France and China, because SaskTel International was the only company that had the ability to actually link the two. Alcatel on the French side, British Tel on the other side, they get together, and the two phone companies could not talk to each other. They couldn't make the wires come together and actually connect. The only company in the world that actually had that capacity, because it used both British Tel and Alcatel equipment, was SaskTel in Regina. They sent a crew over and they connected us. So we went and did a story on the SaskTel guys hooking up basically continental Europe with the UK. So the show did very, very well, and it kind of, I guess, that sort of built my reputation. So at the time, I'm doing SaskBiz magazine. I created my own little newsletter. I was doing television, and I was still freelancing radio and doing business commentaries, which, by the way, I still do today. So I've been 40 years on radio, and I'm on 15 radio stations every day doing a 1-minute piece on business. And then an interesting event occurred in the north end of Saskatoon. There's a crazy man up there who was running the North Saskatoon Business Association at the time, and he decided that he should declare war on the Star Phoenix. Because the business editor of the Star Phoenix was, in his words, a communist and hated the business community. She did beat the hell out of the business community, I'll give her that. So they decided they would start an alternate newspaper in the north end of Saskatoon to compete with the Star Phoenix, and they really didn't care if they succeeded so long as they carved a lot of advertising revenue out of the Star Phoenix. That was the punishment that they wanted to mete out. So the Star Phoenix had to go into defensive mode, so I get the call. So they said, you're going to move to Saskatoon, you're going to take over as business editor. And so I came up here, and I spent 10 years in Saskatoon, and we calmed the waters. And it was a challenging time to be in Saskatoon. It was a challenging time for me as a business commentator and a writer, because Saskatoon was down. And you talked about the time you graduated. You remember LIFT? There's nobody around here who will remember LIFT, but there was a program that was put in place in 1969. Saskatchewan was in such dire straits that LIFT stood for Land in Fallow for Tomorrow. And so it was a federal government program that actually paid farmers not to grow grain. We had excessive amounts of grain around. We were sitting on mountains of inventory. The price was through the floor. Farmers were illegally trading their grain, because in those days the wheat board was around, and wheat, oats, and barley had to go through the board. Farmers were actually trading it off at 2 bushels for 50 cents, and a barley grower would trade it off to a cattle guy, and the cattle guy would give him a calf back or something like that, so he could feed his family. I mean, it was that sort of desperate. So Saskatchewan was just collapsed. And you go back into the late 80s, early 90s, Saskatoon was the same way. Regina, on the other hand, was on fire. 2 major developments had occurred. Farm Credit Canada relocated to Regina, and Crown Life relocated to Regina, all in basically back-to-back. So Regina had like 1,200 housing starts one year. Saskatoon had 2. So this was a very difficult city to be the voice, that little light of beacon of optimism. But it was on that time when I was writing that stuff that I got dragged around, as Gord talked about the opportunity to speak. And as it turns out, I'd probably spoken in virtually every small town in the province. It was a lot of miles, but through that we evolved into something that happened, and it was another one of those seminal moments that you don't expect will really do anything, but there it was. A guy named Stan Schmidt, who was the general manager of what is today Global Television in Saskatoon, it was STV in those days, it was owned by Izzy Asper in Winnipeg. He got elected president of the Saskatchewan Chamber. And his term was going to expire in May of 2000. And he said, you know, I'm going to be president of the provincial chamber to mark the end of a decade, the end of a century, and the end of a millennium. So I should probably take advantage of this. And you know, he's got a media background, so he understood kind of what could be done. So he said, let's take this period of time, because Saskatchewan's going to turn 100 in 2005. So he put this challenge out to the business community. From 2000 to 2005, around these milestone events at the end of a decade and so on, he said, let's spend some time thinking about what do we want to look like in the second century. So he said, basically challenged the province to say, let's write a business plan for our province for the next 100 years. And it's an interesting idea, and he even named it Action Saskatchewan, a blueprint for 2005. So people kicked it around, really didn't know what to do, but a few of us got together one night at Mark McLeod's house out at White City, and bless his wife's heart, she made the best banana bread, and we wouldn't leave till we had this thing done because there was banana loaves coming out of the oven, and we went all night. It was a Sunday night, I'll never forget, and we decided let's put some flesh on the bones of Stan's idea. So we wrote a little piece, and we called it, it was called Action Saskatchewan, and we submitted it to the chamber, and they thought that was kind of cool. And let me tell you what the principal tenets of it were. One was we needed to attack attitude. I didn't really know what that meant at the time, but we had it in there. We also said that perhaps the hidden gem in Saskatchewan, the one untapped resource that needed to be wrap our arms around and really see it as an opportunity, was the First Nations community. That there was a large population base that was underdeveloped and untapped from a labor perspective. And it was at a time when we were exiting, as Gord said, exiting a lot of young people. Saskatchewan's population was what we called hollowed out. We had a lot of kids and a lot of seniors and nothing in between. So there was nobody in the middle to pay the taxes for the kids to consume going to school and the seniors to consume going to the health system. So Saskatchewan was in pretty big trouble. We saw First Nations as a real opportunity. And then we talked about deregulation and some of those kinds of things. But I would say the two big things that came out of Action Saskatchewan that are still prevalent today were around attitude and around the First Nations. We had some ideas on taxation. They never really got any traction. I'm not totally abandoning them, but it was like this. We had a view that said income is income is income, so you should be taxed the same on all forms of income. Shouldn't have a difference between capital gain income, earned income, and rent income, because each of those attracts a different tax rate, and as a consequence, as entrepreneurs, we make decisions based on those tax rates, and effectively what we've got is the tax department deciding what are good investment and bad investment opportunities, when really that should be up to us as investors to make those decisions. So make the government neutral. Here's another one we had suggested. Try this one on. Once you've paid, I'll get your reaction to this. Once you've paid $1 million in personal income tax provincially in your lifetime, you're done. That's enough. So when you run that out, the politics of it look like this. The opposition would say, are you kidding? You mean only the richest wouldn't pay tax going forward? And I would say, yeah, and here's why. If you had $1 million, who's the finance people in the room? Who are the finance majors here? Not a one of them. That'll tell you. You know what? Finance majors get hired by entrepreneurs. Just remember that. They don't become them, they get hired by them. So if you had $1 million in a pot and you put it in a GIC, you'd be making 1.5%. That's $15,000 a year, effectively. Well, the average provincial tax load in the province, the average taxpayer pays $4,400 in provincial income tax. So effectively, that $1 million is equivalent to 3 times the average tax rate. So that's why we said $1 million's enough. Now, what would happen if you said that? All the capital in the country would relocate to here, because all the wealthy guys would come here, pay their tax once, and be done. But they couldn't leave, because as soon as they went to another jurisdiction, they'd be out of the tax-free zone. This would become the Switzerland of Canada. All the money would come here. Right? Wouldn't that be cool? Yeah. And there's also, we said, you should probably put a flat tax on, like 10% is a good number, I think. It's where Alberta was up until a couple hours ago. And what is not talked about is if you're a tax advisor in downtown Toronto and one of your clients sells a business, the tax advisor is bound to say you should relocate to Alberta to execute this transaction because that's where the lowest tax rate is. Well, Alberta no longer has the lowest tax rate, so basically you end up with what's called an address of convenience. For December 31st of that tax year, you move to Alberta, you get an apartment, you pay your tax, and here's what it costs the government of Alberta. Nothing. They don't provide them with a road, they don't provide them with any health care, nothing. It's a gift. So I say, let's make that here. Let's put the lowest tax rate in the country here. We'll have all those gifts. Now, if you add to it, once you paid $1 million, you're done. Those people can't leave. What happens in Alberta is they're there for a day and then they go back to Toronto. But now they're taxable on any income that they generate on the wealth that they've accumulated. But here, they would be stuck here, right? It would be a wonderful trick. But, finance departments don't think like this. This is a more entrepreneurial sort of whisker. But this is what Action Saskatchewan was talking about. But the one that was the most profound, and I got to be cognizant of time. What time do you want me done, Dean? Okay, all right. Was the piece around attitude. As we began to think about this, we thought we got to write something about this. So one of the guys of the 3 or 4 of us, we sent him on the road and said, get some data because we got to start writing this business plan. And he said, what do you want? I said, I don't know, be creative. So you know what he did? He went into grade 8 classrooms in the province. He asked the teacher to leave. He sat down with the kids. Now, for you young people, this will sound bizarre, but this was absolutely pertinent in the year 2000. He asked these grade 8 kids, at what age do you start talking among yourselves on the playground about moving to Alberta? And the answer that came back was age 12. Age 12. We brought that data back to the chamber, and they were, the executive was kind of taken aback. They really didn't know what to think of. But here's what we did know. They were not getting that from reading the business section of the Globe and Mail every day. These 12-year-olds were getting it at home. They were being told by their families, you have no future in Saskatchewan. Start thinking about relocating. Now, think about how disturbing. You remember when you were 12, how upsetting would that have been that you have no future in your town, that your roots are going to be ripped up, you're going to leave your friends, you're going to some place you've heard of but you've never been to. That was the environment we were living in. So that got us going. So we started doing town hall meetings, went around the province, and we did big towns, small, north, south, east, west, didn't really matter. And we would do the traditional SWOT analysis. What are we going to do to make Saskatchewan better in the 2nd century, blah, blah, blah. And we had lots of green and all this sort of stuff. But inevitably somebody stood up in the room, some business person, because these were chamber meetings. It was predominantly business folks that turned up. There were heads of service clubs and the local pastor or whatever in a small town, but generally it was business people. They would stand up and they'd look at the facilitator and they'd go like this. What's the government doing to build my business? Now think about that line. The chamber was absolutely rocked. What's the government doing to build my business? They realized that it was their own members that had lost their way too. Now, we were kind of instructed by the chamber to get in the face of business people as a result of this, but it's not exactly the best way to sell memberships, is to go to your prospect and say, you're an idiot. Right? Get your head out of where the sun don't shine. That's what we did. And here's the way it kind of evolved. It went like this. What we began to realize was this mindset that was in play. We ended up calling it scarcity-based thinking, but it goes like this. It says, if you're doing well and you're doing well, doesn't that mean you two are getting a bigger piece of the pie? And if you are, it stands to reason I'm getting a smaller one. So I have to hate you. What we realized was there was a bias against success. That's what was pervading the province at the time, was we had this attitudinal issue that success was the enemy. Anybody here grew up in a small town? In the small town you grew up in, when the local hardware dealer bought a new car, what was said in town? We've made enough money, or he's made enough money off us, we don't need to deal with him anymore. Now, that's this kind of anti-success bias. But then if you stop and think about it, you imagine trying to build a winning football team by going around trying to not find the best players? That's effectively what we're doing. We're saying, let's build a community, but anybody who's good, let's get rid of them. If you think about it in the context of a credit union, I mean, isn't it better off with more deposits than fewer? I mean, this was the approach that we took out into the country, and this is what Gord was talking about, that I was the guy who was the kind of mouthpiece of this thing. I got to go around all corners of the province and basically get in the face of business audiences and say, stop thinking like this. Challenge that thinking and saying, we've got to go from that scarcity-based thinking 180 degrees to abundance-based thinking, which says, if you're doing well and you're doing well, doesn't it mean our community's wealthier as a consequence? How can that be bad? We should actually build on that stuff. And we tried to get them to just do this. Stop pointing at that guy over there and point here and say, I'm the issue. And it actually got some traction. We did. And I think that we changed attitudes in the province towards our ability to accept success. And fast forward 5 years to when the Saskatchewan economy began to take off, and I'll dispute a little bit or take exception a little bit to Gord's recollection of history, because I think that what lifted Saskatchewan was the stuff going on in China, the change in the middle class, the emergence over there, demand for food, fertilizer. I call it the 3 Fs. There is a premier in this province who quotes the 3 Fs, but he doesn't attribute. It came from me on the back page column in Saskatchewan Business, just so you know. Just saying, all right? But it was those things that started to take off, and really what lifted the Saskatchewan economy was investment. Was as capital flowed in here, we started to construct things that attracted people to build. The builders came in, and then with it came all of the stuff that you need to support all of that growth. More retail, more people came in. And there's a saying in the economic development world. I was chairman of the board of the Economic Development Authority in Regina for 8 years. That says people follow opportunity. Just as kids from Saskatchewan followed opportunity into Alberta for 25 years, from 82 basically to 06 was the out-migration period, that in 04 we started to see the investment capital start to flow in. By 06, the population decline had stopped and actually reversed and started to increase. People follow opportunity, but there's about a 2-year lag time. So 04 was when we saw stuff start to happen, and that was the triggering of investment that was coming largely because of the events going on in the Far East. And for the next 10 years, we saw this huge capital inflow into Saskatchewan. To give you an idea of magnitude, in the 10 years leading up to 04, our average capital inflow into the province was $7 billion a year. That's fresh capital going into plant, building, equipment, technology. Last year was $21 billion, so it's tripled. And it's been over $20 billion for the last 3 years. So we saw from 7 climb right up to $20 billion. Well, that profoundly changed the platform that the Saskatchewan economy works on. And this is all investment. You don't unbuild a mine. I mean, it's here, it's permanent. You can't change it. So I had a chance to, chronicle all of that, and it inspired me, of course, to watch what was going on. So I played a few games as well. After I left the Star Phoenix, basically change in publisher. I had been on the coattails of the previous publisher. He got a job with Southam, so off he goes to Stardom in Kingston, and new guy comes in. He sees me as this part of the other team, so I got fired in a phone booth in Cranbrook. I phoned home, there was a voicemail, I knew who it was, I phoned him and he tied a can to my tail. But he left me on, it was nice, he left me stay on as a columnist. For 2 years after I left the Star Phoenix, I was still a columnist, so I would appear every Saturday. But by then we were hatching plans for something called the Free Press. So we created a newspaper, it was a twice-weekly paper, one in Regina, one in Saskatoon. So my partner was a Saskatoon guy, and I had lived in Regina before, so I went back to Regina and I took over that operation. My wife's family's all there, so it made sense for us to move back. So we ran that, and we decided we could take on the Star Phoenix and Leader Post, and we could go head-to-head with them, and we could knock them out of the batting box. Well, they were owned by a guy named Conrad Black. Let me tell you what I learned. You sometimes get wet when you stand under a big dog. And we had raised some money. We had gone to Working Ventures at that time, a national labor-sponsored venture capital fund. They put in $5 million, and we rode that puppy until there wasn't any money left. And basically, I learned from that when you stand with tall dogs, you could get hurt. But I look back on that, and it was a great experience because we learned a lot. But I do know this: Conrad Black went to jail. I didn't. So I see that as a win. And a good friend of mine says that good decisions come from experience, and experience comes from bad decisions. So it's all part of the exercise. And if you come to these lectures, I'm sure you hear more about the failures of entrepreneurs than about the successes, because most entrepreneurs, you guys are serial entrepreneurs, you see a lot of failure. People learn from these things, so don't get disturbed or distressed that you get on. Hopefully there's enough pieces left over at the end that you can pick them up and start to put together the next shape of the puzzle that you're going to change or chase. So I've had an opportunity I probably dealt with more bankruptcies and crashes than successes in my life. My first venture was about half a dozen of us crazies got together one night and we said, we should be rich. Let's buy some land somewhere. Well, we bought some land in Texas and got our lunch handed to us. So the next major investment was we bought a piece of a nightclub in Regina. Within a month, it was bankrupt. So that didn't work so good. But we were learning. And we always called that was tuition, right? We paid tuition. We learned something, and we just had to decide we better not take that class again. But later on, I got invited to sit on the board of the largest hog producer in the province. It's called Big Sky Farms. I ended up as chairman of the board, and we had commodity games are very volatile, and so sometimes the price of pigs was high, and you'd make an absolute fortune, and the next year they were in the tank, and you could get wiped out. So we went through hit the wall, and we went through a bankruptcy restructuring in the U.S. They would call it Chapter 11. We rebuilt it, got it going again, and that was a big company. We're doing a couple of $100 million a year and 500 employees, and then one day we woke up, and we'd just come off, I remember we just got the July statements, and the CFO said to us, I think we've turned the corner, we can see some light here, this looks pretty good. And then 2 days later, the U.S. Department of Agriculture came out with an announcement that said there was a whole lot less corn in stock than they imagined in the granaries in the U.S., so the price of corn went up 30% overnight. And that dictated the price of feed grain in North America. Our costs went up 30% overnight. We ran out of cash within a month, and we couldn't feed the animals. We had 1 million head of stock, and we couldn't feed them. So we went to the bank, basically, and said, here's the keys. And we turned it over to them. So effectively, there was receivership. Then the next time we went around, we got smacked with exactly the same thing. We ended up, that company's now it's been sold and is part of the Olymel operation. But again, I got to watch, this is the challenges that you have in a commodity-based economy such as Saskatchewan, where you have big swings. So we had 10 years, the last 10 years were really big upswings. The previous 10 years where we watched so many people go away and it was dark here. It was the other side of that equation. So right now I think we're in a plateau, and it's a little bit challenging. But I think if you permit a couple of minutes, just talk about some of the entrepreneurs that I've had a chance to cover as well, because I drew inspiration from some of them, and for the most part they're likely names you've never heard of. A guy named Tom Lang, who was the first guy that I worked for. He owned the radio station in Weyburn, but that was just a little hobby of his. He had actually built a business in the soft drink industry, so he had a plant in Weyburn, and he ended up with the franchise for Coca-Cola for Manitoba, so he did pretty handsomely. And he befriended a guy named George Solomon. And George was another crazy entrepreneur. And these two guys, I think they had a couple pops one night. And they said, it's all wrong that Saskatchewan grows all this rye grain that they used to make whiskey, and we don't make any of it here. So they built a distillery in Weyburn, those two guys. And it ultimately, didn't work very well. They sold it off to Weisers, to one of the biggies, and then got transitioned again. Now it's making ethanol. But these are the guys that were really visionary. They came to Saskatoon in the late 60s, early 70s, and they had decided they could build a plant that would make binder twine, but out of plastic rather than sisal. And they were only 50 years ahead of their time. And they ended up kind of not making any money with it, but they sold it off to Imperial Oil, and as George told me, he said, we didn't get hurt. But George is a guy, his daughter, by the way, is the lieutenant governor today, Vaughn Solomon Schofield. So her dad was this legendary guy. He and Bob Kramer went head-to-head to get the Caterpillar franchise for Saskatchewan. Kramer won it, and that George didn't get it, so George was then free to chase everything else. He ended up at one point, his company, Western Tractor, had 28 heavy machinery franchises. So Caterpillar, their agreements are very tight. The Kramer family could play only Caterpillar. George had the waterfront, and he started a lot of companies. He did very well. But in '69, that time when we were right at the bottom of the barrel, his business hit the wall. He was on the board of the Bank of Montreal, and the bank had basically wanted to pull his company down. And it's pretty hard when you're a bank. The chairman of the board is going to take down one of his directors' companies, right? So they phoned and said, George, meet me in Winnipeg. So the CEO flew out from Toronto, and he met Winnipeg, and he said, George, you gotta like lay off a bunch of people and downsize. George said, I can't lay people off. He said, they're like family. I can't take their jobs from them. And they said, well, it's too late. They said, while we're sitting here, my team's in Regina basically shutting down your business. We're going to lay off most of the people, and there'll be an enterprise left there. George went back to Regina, and he's obviously devastated. But you know, he found jobs for 169 people. He got on the phone, and he started calling around, and he said, I got this guy, you need to hire him. And they placed him all over Western Canada, and he said, most of them got better jobs than I could give them. But that's the kind of guy, I just looked at this, and I thought, this is inspirational guy. I could like to be like that. And it was not just about the dollar. And it was powerful stuff. But the one thing I learned as a journalist is that it's way more than the money. It's the entrepreneurs who build stuff, who make stuff happen, who create opportunity. And 5% of the world really is an entrepreneur. 95% are followers. They're employees. A lot of people hold themselves out as wanting to be entrepreneurs, but they aren't. It's those people who have that ability. And I'll just close with this story. I played golf with two guys out at North Battleford. One was the mayor of the town, one was the city economic development officer. The city guy, the economic development guy, was a pure, business sensitive, pro-business guy, but he was a government employee. And that was his hard wiring. The mayor was this crazy entrepreneur. And let me tell you how this shaped up. We finished our round of golf, we went into the clubhouse, and we sat down, and the city employee guy says, you know what, guys? 2 payments left and I own my house. He said, I can hardly wait to get rid of the millstone. You know what the mayor said? Ah! How could you do that? He said, if I've got $10 of equity in my house, I go borrow it from the bank so I can build another apartment building. And there was the difference. One needed the security of no debt. The other one said, debt is a tool that I'm going to put to work. And there is the hardwiring difference. 5% of the world is, let's just damn the torpedoes and make this thing go because I see nothing but opportunity and places to grow. This guy, this crazy mayor, one day Peter Pocklington had decided he was putting a bacon factory up somewhere in Western Canada. He phoned the city economic development guy at 6 o'clock. He said, we're driving to Edmonton tonight. I'll be over there in an hour. So they drove up to Edmonton. They went all night. They went into Pocklington's office the next morning, demanded to see him, went in and convinced him, and he put that bacon plant in North Battleford. Now, I don't know an economic development officer who ever would have pulled that off, but that entrepreneur, he did. Because it was, what do you mean it can't be done? We'll just go tell the guy we're doing it, or he's doing it. And that's what entrepreneur is. They just don't know that that cavern in front of you is actually dangerous. They just take the next step and, well, if I'm halfway down, I'll figure out a parachute, right? This is just what they do. They dam the torpedoes and they figure out, well, we'll sort out the problems later because they've got a dream, an idea. But these are the ones who build communities. They create jobs. They're the ones who, when I look back at all of the downtimes, it was because we lacked that spirit, vision, energy, those crazies who would make stuff happen. They were going to other jurisdictions. And when Saskatchewan was up, it was we were capitalizing on these things that I wasn't smart enough to see over in China when the middle class was emerging, but people who looked at Saskatchewan and said, here's a jurisdiction that's got all the assets the world wants, energy, fuel, and fertilizer, or food and fertilizer. And these things all come together. Demand for protein around the world is what's going to drive this place. and it's going to be good for fertilizer production, it's going to be good for grain production, it's going to be good for livestock production. So when I look at these things, I say, who's the guy who's clever enough to be able to see opportunity? I hope I've seen a few. The latest one that I'm on right now is we're doing some work. I have a PR firm with a few partners, and I've conceived an idea I call the contract newsroom, and I'm not sure they're 100% figured out what we're doing with this, or what Paul's vision looks like, but it goes something like this. How many websites have you seen that have been built and abandoned? Corporate websites. They become a poster for a business and they never change. What we're going to do is never build a website. We're going to come in after they're built and just keep them current. So I'm building effectively a newsroom like I ran at the Star Phoenix. I'm hiring journalists because apparently they're being shed by all over the place, and we're just going to go on a contract basis and be able to provide services to companies for effectively a contract or a fractional journalist is what we're going to provide. So one day a week, we'll send a journalist to your business. We'll produce a lot of stories about your clients, about yourself, your history. We'll do your social media. Once a week, we'll show up for 8 hours, and you pay us a fee for that. And what's interesting is we'll end up with about, hopefully we get 40, 50, 60 clients or something. There's 40 or 50 stories a day that are coming out. That's probably the equivalent of the number of stories you see in a daily newspaper. We can create our own online digital news service doing that. We'll produce a local news service with 50 or 60 stories a day. And what's interesting is this is scalable because it's not required to be only in Saskatchewan. We can serve clients all over the place. So my next stop is Phoenix. Why? Because I have a house there. I want to spend the winter in Phoenix, so I'm going to build myself my next contract newsroom. Well, first is Regina and Saskatoon, second is Phoenix. Sounds like a plan. That's what I'm going to do. Thanks for letting me join you. I'd be pleased to take a question or two if there are any.
We want to throw to the most entrepreneurial person that has no fear of asking a question.
There's one.
Yes.
All right.
No overhand. Hello?
It's a big Nerf ball, so it's not...
I had two things. One, I've tasted Carla's banana bread, and it's really good. Two, I've been into a lot of leadership classes lately and articles, so I was just wondering if you've ever considered yourself a leader of change.
Yeah, I guess you do. I probably would think that way, and I think probably the pinnacle of my exercise in that was the Action Saskatchewan stuff, because I became the voice of it. And we actually built a few media campaigns around it too. We had a television series that we called Growing the Future, I think, and then we had one, Seeds of Success, which was agriculture, and we had another one for First Nations. So we had 3 radio and television campaigns going at the same time, and those were, attacking attitudes. So we did a pretty amazing job on this. The newspapers gave us a page in the paper every week for 65 weeks. So I wrote 65 pages in the paper. I did these multimedia campaigns, did every small town. It was like 4 years of my life. And McLeod, Mark challenged me. He said, "You go out and you make $100,000 off this." And I exceeded his expectations. But it was funny. I took this idea called Action Saskatchewan and turned it into a business. And it really, kind of fed my family for about 3 or 4 years. And it also set me up to be a bit of a voice in the province. And yeah, the media profile that I had from working radio, TV, newspaper, this just carried it to the last step. So I guess I would be an agent of change. But I'll give you this. I carry a lot of frustration on it because change comes so slowly. And what I think is stuff we should have been embracing 10 years ago, we're finally getting around to. That's the only thing I'd say. Yeah, I'm probably an agent of change, but it goes way slower than you think. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Well,
You got no question. You just wanted to play with
I
the
just wanna play
toy.
with
Exactly.
I listened to your stories, your minute snippets, and I'm happy now I can finally put a face to that voice that I listened to. And for a guy that I think kind of got a little lucky on his 87% in English, you're a hell of a writer and storyteller, and the art of telling a story is a very important thing to an entrepreneur. And I was hoping you could share, I guess, a bit of advice with the room in terms of what makes a good storyteller a good storyteller. Because I'll tell you, when you get in an elevator with a person, you got to do your pitch. Being able to be good at what you do is, I think, a key success factor for anybody who wants to be an entrepreneur.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And in our PR firm, I actually put a tagline on it. And I can claim credit for this, but our tagline is "We tell your stories," because I really fully subscribe to your view that storytelling is what it's about. And all of us have a story, and we don't do a very good job of telling it. So that's what I think the role of our business is in this marketplace. But I'm going to tell you that most people talk about what they're going to do for you or how they're going to do it in business, which is boring. It's why. It's the Simon Sinek thing, right? Start with why, and tell me why is it important that I connect with you. It's not what you're going to do or how you're going to do it, because I can get bids from people to tell me how to do things. But I need to know that you understand the deeper meaning of the story. And you'd be amazed at where you will find assets. I'll just share one little story with you. I'm involved with an organization called TEC. It stands for the Executive Committee. It's a CEO development group, and I looked after Saskatchewan for many years. Now we've got a few more chairs, that's what they call us, chairs in the province. So we've got probably 5 or 6 CEO and senior executive groups operating in the province. But I had a chance to go down to Camp Pendleton, which is the Marine Corps base on the west coast, just out of San Diego, Coronado, and it's where they train the SEALs and all that stuff. And we got a chance to sit down. We're supposed to meet with all the generals and all that stuff, right? Well, we got there. From the day we booked it until we got there, a war got declared. So when we arrived, there was nobody there. There was basically one drill sergeant. So they brought back the retired general who commanded the place. And he talked to us about his leadership style. And this is one thing that has just stood out in my head about where you can find leadership opportunities in storytelling. And he said, we have 50,000 troops on this base, so we're changing through people a lot. There's a lot of transfers in and out. So he made a mandatory meeting every Friday at 2 o'clock. If you were a newbie who had been transferred onto the base, mandatory requirement, you attend the general's office. And any officer, executive officer who was on base that day had to attend as well. And he started out by reading them a history lesson, give them a history lesson. And in the military, they have what they call the colors. It's a staff, and it's got chevrons on it. And if you know military history, you can read this tells you all the battles this unit's been in. And he said, our Marine Corps unit, we've been to war in the Second World War, we were in Korea, Vietnam, and he said, we'd never been defeated. We'd had our asses kicked, and we had to back up, regroup, and go forward, but we never been run over. And he said, I decided I was not going to be the first general to preside over a defeat. So this was his meeting. Everybody would show up, and he would read them through the history, and he'd say, we've never lost, and I will not preside over the first defeat. So that is the standard of performance you're expected to deliver while you're on this base. Think about that. He was using corporate history and a story as a performance management tool. That is pretty interesting. And he said, when I was a colonel in Vietnam, and his contemporaries were Colin Powell and Schwarzkopf and Hal Moore and these guys, said I had a fire base on the north end of South Vietnam. So I'm in the middle of the jungle, and I'm in a valley, and I've got 5,000 troops, and we got helicopters. So I can fly in new stuff all the time, new guys, new ammunition, food, whatever. And he said in the hills around us, the enemy had 40,000 troops. So every night we'd go out and we'd have these little skirmishes like you see in the movies, right? These platoons would be out in the jungle or wherever. And he said they'd come back in the morning. And he said, day 72 of this battle, we're out of gas. And he said, I started to think that if the enemy came out of the hills, they came down en masse, I could not repel them, we would be run over. So he said, I called my officers in, and I said, we got to build an evacuation plan, because if they come at us, we're not going to make it. So let's figure out how we're going to handle the big attack. And he said, we worked out this plan, but one of the things we did, and he said, this will sound peculiar to you, but it made sense to us at the time. One of the things the officer had agreed to was they were going to take that little flag, they were going to tear it up, and each of them was going to take a piece of it, and they were going to eat it. Because they said, our thinking was, the enemy can have this piece of ground, they can't have my history. Right? I'm taking that with me. And he said, we never told the troops, but the word leaked out. He said the next day was like fresh energy had been blown into these guys. He said we were fired up again. And he said the guys would go out, there were really good skirmishes out there. He said I could never have stood on a soapbox and made a speech about one more for the Gipper that would have lit them up like this did. And he said the whole notion of history and culture and this bond that we have with people who we don't know, who come before us, was so powerful. He said the morning of day 93, we woke up, and during the night, the enemy had withdrawn. So he said, why did I win? Better tactics? No. History. It's my story. That's what won the battle for him. Well, this guy was just, I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, okay, I'm the journalist guy here. This is like resonating for me, right? And it was a kick in the tail for me to do a better job of writing, do a better job of storytelling. It's about that dig deeper thing that I talked about at the beginning. This guy was not about tactics and better guns or whatever. It was about finding something deep inside the human psyche that was motivating, and that was what was changing his marketplace effectively. Any other questions? Up here. All right, the big overhand fire. Here we go.
Nice job, Brian. Good toss. I wanted to ask, I think that there's some caution now, maybe even more so for the students that have, want to enter the workforce soon, are looking for good opportunities, and yet as a manufacturer, we're seeing lots of export opportunities. Where do you see things for Saskatoon and Saskatchewan moving forward? How do we inspire and move forward when there's a little bit of caution now around energy and some of the other resources?
Yeah, and I think that probably you're right that there is some caution, but I don't know that that's different today than it was in my generation or any others, because we're kind of fired up coming out of school, right? Except for the part where I don't know what the hell I'm doing, right? But we got a lot of energy and a lot of drive, and we got some imagination and we got some ideas, but we don't really come to school to learn how to implement them. That's where the experience piece comes. And so I would think that it's not much different today than it was 20 years ago or 50 years ago or 100 years ago. The one difference is this, that change comes, the velocity of change is much higher today. So a good idea today might actually be expired 3 years from now, where a good idea in my day might have had a 20-year run. That's one of the challenges. So you've constantly got to be innovating. And Darwin was right. It's not the strongest who survive, it's those who can adapt. And so I think young people have a distinct advantage there. Now, you asked me, where's Saskatoon, where's Saskatchewan going? We're not going to get away from our basic strengths, land base, fertilizer, energy, and these are things that nature blessed us with. We don't throw those away, they don't go away. So there's always going to be some opportunity around that. Where I think that there's some untapped stuff, there really is an opportunity in the First Nations community. I think we need to figure out, help them bridge the gap there. I know quite a few of the leaders in the First Nations community, and we have long conversations, and it kind of goes like this. What drives Western society, what makes our society work, is self-interest, right? Personal ownership, trying to get ahead, we look after ourselves, I look after my own pension plan, that kind of stuff, right? In the First Nations community, it's much more communal. A hunter brings a deer to the community, everybody shares in it, nobody owns it. That personal ownership piece doesn't exist there. But yet they want to figure out how to tie into the Western society. So there's a cultural gap for them. And I think that I see one of my roles going forward, and one of the areas I want to work in, is help them build a private sector. Because most of this, there's a lot of successful First Nations enterprises in the province, but they're all communally owned. They're owned by a tribal council or an individual First Nation, or in the case of SIGA, they're owned by FSIN or operated by FSIN. So, and I had an opportunity to speak to the leadership about a year ago, actually, and so I'm down in the crowd, and there's all these chiefs and councilors and everything, and I asked them this question. How many rich Indians do you know? And one finger went up. So I asked them, what's wrong with that picture? Right? We got to figure out how to help them get much more involved and become a more significant part of the economy. I think they're already a significant part, but there's a lot more opportunity for them. So if you can figure out how to tap into that, I think you're onto something really cool. And there is this one little thing going on that's in our favor right now, the devalued Canadian dollar. We had some real export opportunities here. And then there's the whole value add, that whole sort of knowledge piece that I think, because we've had so much success historically on the commodity side, we've not done a whole lot of stuff on R&D and technology and that kind of stuff. Yeah, we've got our success stories, but it's not rampant. And I think that's where I see significant opportunity going forward. Does that answer your question? Yeah. There, I've lit a whole lot of fires. And you want me to leave you with my one crazy idea? Yeah? All right, I've been bugging the Premier, and we'll see. I put this in his ear. We'll see if it goes anywhere. I've talked to premiers before with crazy ideas, and all of them have turned out to be this much. But this one, we'll see. I think one of the more interesting political developments in the country that turned into an economic success story was Newfoundland taking Labrador as part of the province. So Labrador went from territory to province. So I've encouraged our current Premier, I'm encouraging every audience I speak to, wouldn't it be cool if Saskatchewan had the Northwest Territories? So I've been encouraging him to say, maybe you want to think about that, because if there is something to climate change, then we'd have a port. But also there's think it through, it'll come to you. There's $150 billion worth of mining projects identified, mining and energy developments identified across the Arctic. About half of those would be in the territories. That's what's lifted Saskatchewan for the last 10 years. Why wouldn't we go and grab that next one? And what's interesting possibility is then all the staging for all of that would all happen out of Saskatoon rather than Edmonton. And I think it's a really interesting opportunity. So I put it in the Premier's ear. I ran into him a week later and I said, so? And he goes, don't talk to my wife. She's mad at you right now because I've been obsessing on it. So anyway, we'll see. I was hoping he would meet the Premier of the Territories today at the First Minister's meeting, but as it turns out, NWT had an election yesterday. So I'm pretty sure the Premier was back in Northwest Territories. They have different elections than we do. They elect all the MLAs at large, and then they sit down, and among them they pick a Premier, and then out of that they pick a cabinet. So it's not a party line system. But anyway, that's just one of my crazy, that and the tax thing, and so those are some of my haywire ideas. And this is maybe a good story for entrepreneurs, that you have 50 good ideas and one gets traction. So don't get too frustrated that your 49 fall in the ditch, but keep pitching them. Anybody else? If not, thanks for letting me join you.